Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Zaina Lutfia, and I'm the interim director of the Moro Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first Brown Bag Lecture of the 2023 academic year. I want to start first with the land acknowledgement from the University of Manitoba. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So the Brown Bag Lectures is a long-time series where we invite various individuals to present on their work and to gain their perspectives. And this is the first one of this semester. And Jason Brennan will be sending everyone information on subsequent lectures that have been planned or are being planned. Now it is my pleasure to turn over the microphone, if you will, to Yulia Ivaniuk, who will introduce our guest speaker for today. Thank you and welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yulia Ivaniuk, and I'm the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. The center is honored to co-organize today's lecture with the Arthur V. Moore Institute for Peace and Justice at St. Paul's College, and also with the Peace and Conflict Studies graduate program. We're also pleased to inform you that we also offer monthly lecture series and bi-monthly reading club sessions. So if you're interested in these, feel free to reach out to us at cukes@umanitoba.ca. So we have a really timely topic to discuss here today, the impact of the war on journalism in Ukraine. And it is my great honor to introduce Olga Tokariuk, who is an independent journalist, a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C., and also a journalist fellow, Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, UK. Olga has vast experience working with Ukrainian and international media, and her professional interests include international relations and disinformation research. Olga has worked with numerous outlets both in Europe and in North America. She holds an MA in political science and international relations from the University of Bologna in Italy and an MA in journalism from the Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. I shall also admit that I've been an avid follower of Olga's on Twitter, so thank you so much, Olga, for your posts, and welcome. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Yulia, for introducing me. It's my pleasure to open the year of lectures at the University of Manitoba. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, those who are following on Zoom, and for coming if you are listening to me in the room. So let's structure this talk like this. I will speak for about half an hour, and then I'm very much looking forward to answer your questions. I want it to be as informal as possible. I'm a journalist. I'm not an academic, so do not expect an academic, presentation today. It's mostly my personal impressions and also the summary of, some research that has already been done looking into the impact of full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine on Ukrainian journalism. So I'll start sharing my screen in a moment. Great. Okay, so let's immediately move to the presentation. So what's the impact of full-scale war that Russia launched on Ukraine almost 1 year ago on February 24th, 2022 on Ukrainian journalism? And, I'd like to start with a very obvious impact of war. We all became war reporters. And I would like to quote here Yefrem Lukatsky, who is an Associated Press photographer and one of the most experienced Ukrainian photographers. So in an interview to the Ukrainians, he said, "We Ukrainian journalists cannot return home from this war as our foreign colleagues do when they get tired. The war is in our home. And I absolutely agree with that. Every Ukrainian journalist, regardless of their record, of their background, has become a war reporter and has been affected by this war. Another personal experience that I want to share, the first media casualty of the full-scale war was my ex-colleague. His name was Yevgeny Sakun. We worked together on TV more than 10 years ago, and he was killed by a Russian missile on March 1st, 2022, during the bombardment of Kyiv's TV tower. So, very early in this war, I felt what it is to lose my colleagues. And unfortunately, Yevgeny was not the last person, not the last colleague that I knew personally who has been killed in this war. So according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, at least 15 journalists have been killed in Ukraine since February 24th. And here are some faces of these journalists. And, well, this figure, which is most likely an underestimate, it includes both foreign and Ukrainian journalists. And I just want to mention several names. Sasha Kovshinova, Fox News fixer. She was killed on March 14 during the battle for Irpin in Kyiv region. Max Levin, photographer, very experienced photographer who covered the war in Donbass since 2014. He was found dead on April 1st in Kyiv region. And Viktor Dedov, cameraman, was killed on March 11 in his home in Mariupol during Russian bombardment. So, very personal losses. People I knew, people I worked with were killed in this war early on. And some other people I knew, they joined the Ukrainian army and went to fight. So my former colleagues, such as Andriy Bashtovy, the village editor-in-chief, he became a soldier. He joined the Ukrainian army. You can see the transformation, remarkable, from him wearing civilian clothes into the military clothes. And another colleague, Anastasia Blishchik, who used to be an Ukrainian TV journalist and presenter, she became a soldier as well. And this happened after her fiancé, Alexander Makhov, who you see here on the left, was killed in the war. Alexander fought as a Ukrainian soldier back in 2014, defending his native Luhansk region of Ukraine. Then he worked as a journalist for Ukrainian TV. And when Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, he went to fight again, and he was killed near Izium on May 4th. So journalists who went to fight get killed in this war. They also become prisoners of war, like Maxim Butkevich, who you see on the right photo. Maxim Butkevich is another my personal connection, a very good friend of mine with whom we worked together on Ukrainian TV and radio. Maxim was working at Hromadske Radio. He's also known as a human rights defender, especially focusing on the rights of migrants and refugees in Ukraine. He joined the Ukrainian armed forces right after Russian full-scale invasion, and he was taken as a prisoner of war around May or June last year. The news of his being taken a prisoner appeared on Russian Telegram channels and Russian propaganda TV stations, but there have been no news about his whereabouts or his condition since then. And well, of course, we as his colleagues are very worried, and we, try to keep the attention on his case in hope that one day he can be exchanged and he can return to Ukraine from Russian captivity. So, the various ways how journalists, and many of them felt that they cannot that some of them, they felt that they should cover this war, but some of them felt that they should go and fight and become soldiers, because in Ukraine, it's not just the army, the professional army that is fighting, it's people from so many different backgrounds, including journalists. And after, this, showing you these photos, because I want to make, to put a face to the story, here are some figures, and let's now talk about, a summary and the studies that have been conducted about this war, about this year, 2022, for Ukrainian journalism. So I think it won't be an exaggeration to say that it was the toughest year for Ukrainian media, mostly because a huge decline in advertising revenues. You see on the slide that advertisement revenues fell by more than 80% for TV, 79% for print, and 61% for the radio. That more than 200 regional media outlets went bankrupt or were forced to shut down for other reasons, such as occupation by Russia. This is a huge figure. Also, some big TV station owners, oligarchs, they lost a significant part of their assets, and this led to them cutting funding to their media outlets, or even getting rid of them altogether, as is the case with Ukrainian TV of Rinat Akhmetov. Other media that survived big TV stations, they laid off a big part of their staff, such as 1+1 TV that laid off a quarter of its employees in 2022. And of course, another challenge for the Ukrainian media in 2022 was the destruction or occupation of their newsrooms, and then challenges to return to work after the occupation of Kharkiv and Kherson regions. A feature of year 2022 on Ukrainian TV and broadcasting media was so-called United TV Marathon. It's an interesting phenomenon. It appeared very early in the first days of war, when 6 biggest TV channels united their newsrooms to produce content together. This was done 24/7. The most familiar and recognizable faces, TV presenters participated in this, journalists also who had public trust joined this effort. There was a public broadcaster Suspilne participating. It was part of this United TV Marathon. So initially, the idea of this United Marathon, it was praised by the society and the government, was supported by the government, because it was seen as an opportunity to provide trustworthy information in the initial stage of war, when there was a lot of confusion and a lot of fakes, enemy information operations, chaos, so to stop the spread of panic. But as the marathon has been going on, some concerns emerged over whether it was really such a good idea and how long it should last. Yeah, I mentioned also that there is a budget funding for this marathon for the year 2023. There were some issues with the funding in the past year, but the government is providing quite significant funding for this United TV Marathon for 2023, which actually raises concerns also about the control of the narrative that the government has over this marathon. So there are some cons and the controversy that surrounds it, because 3 opposition TV channels that are related to ex-President Poroshenko were excluded from the production of this marathon, and because they refused to broadcast it, and in response they were removed from digital TV networks. It is also unclear, and it's a subject of debate, how long this United TV Marathon will run. Will it run until the end of war? And there are also concerns over the government control of the narrative, and especially some participants on some TV stations that participate in this marathon, such as Rada TV, which is perceived as very close to the office of the Ukrainian president, and that is seen as basically a government mouthpiece. There is also criticism that is related to poor coordination between different newsrooms in this marathon, because it is not rare that the same speakers appear in the marathon in a row, or the same questions are being asked, because different newsrooms, they do not coordinate their guests or the topics that they want to talk about. And also some presenters of this TV marathon are seen as very controversial, and because they are perceived as pro-Russian in the past, and they were working on pro-Russian TV stations. And another feature of 2022, in the end of the year, a new Ukrainian media law was adopted and signed by President Zelensky. It was adopted by the parliament on December 13th, 2022, and it is seen as a part of the legislation that Ukraine has to adopt in order to align its legislative framework with the European Union. However, there are again concerns over this law, because it gives more powers to the National Council on TV and Radio, and it will have the ability to regulate not only the broadcast media, TV and radio, as it was before, but now it will be able also to regulate all online media, suspend or fine them if they violate the law. So there is a debate in the Ukrainian society among the media professionals whether the National Council on TV and Radio will use these powers or whether it will abuse these powers, actually. Also because the NCTR is appointed by the president and the parliament, and there is very little possibility for journalists to actually influence its decisions. Here are some of the challenges that Ukrainian journalists are facing since the full-scale invasion by Russia. The first group of challenges are physical difficulties. Journalists work in unsafe and unpredictable conditions. Sometimes they lack or there is a shortage of protective equipment and health insurance. And most recently, there are very frequent electricity and internet cutoffs because of Russian missile and drone attacks. Of course, on the occupied territories, there are even more pressing physical difficulties in work of journalists because journalists are being kidnapped and tortured by the Russian occupying forces. Then another group of challenges are bureaucratic challenges that are related to the procedure of getting permits to work in frontline areas and liberated territories. The procedure has been criticized as taking very long time, as being very arbitrary when some journalists are denied the accreditation, and also non-transparent because it's unclear why some media and some journalists are denied this access and the ability to work on especially liberated territories. There was a controversy over the work of some TV crews in Kherson immediately after its liberation. Then another group of challenges are psychological and emotional. Ukrainian journalists are affected by war on a personal level. Many lost their homes, their loved ones, or sources of income, and that, of course, has an impact on the work. And the last but not least, it's another challenge. It's a competition with foreign media that sometimes, or quite often, in fact, have more resources. And also not very rarely, they are prioritized by Ukrainian officials when it comes to agreeing to interviews sometimes. And me, you know, also as working for foreign outlets, I felt how, you know, it was sometimes easier to get an interview arranged with Ukrainian officials if you represent a foreign outlet, because at some point in the war, they felt that it was more important to talk to international audience and to international journalists than to Ukrainian journalists and Ukrainian media. And here is, I also want to share with you the results of a study of Ukrainian local media needs during wartime. This study was conducted by Lviv Media Forum with the support of the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And this study involved 61 local media in all regions of Ukraine, except the occupied Crimea. I find it interesting because it not only focuses on the needs of the nationwide media, which generally are in a better shape, in better position than local media, but it actually focuses more on the regional media. And the goal of this study was to understand the needs of local news organizations and how to address them. It's interesting that 3 media organizations that participated in this study were located on Russian occupied territories of Ukraine. So here are some of the main findings of this study. That 26% of local media said they faced direct threats to life and well-being of their staff. 38% said they experienced other threats to their staff, and 61% said they experienced cyber attacks. Also, 56% of local media organizations said their staff had to fully or partially change their allocation after the full-scale Russian invasion. It was 80% in the case of the media from the front zone, meaning the territories that are close to Russian occupied territories or were under Russian occupation in the initial phase of war. And most staff that was relocated moved to western regions of Ukraine, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Chernivtsi, Khmelnytsky. But in case of media from Donetsk and Luhansk regions, they mostly moved to Dnipro and Kyiv. And some media staff moved abroad to Poland and Germany most frequently. The local media staff that participated in this survey also mentioned several groups of challenges that they face, and they identified these challenges as safety related, how to work under occupation or in evacuation, proximity to fighting, uncertainty, and threats because of their pro-Ukrainian position. Second group of challenges were reputational, how to survive as media organization and preserve the trust of the audience. The third group of challenges were informational, how to get access to information. And the fourth group of challenges were managerial, because of the breakup of business model, loss of revenues, and changed format of work. Managers had to rethink their approach and how to make their media survive in those very new, unexpected, challenging conditions. And among the urgent needs that the local media organizations identified were those of financial needs. This was the most pressing need. 75% of local media organizations reported the need of additional funding. And it is interesting that most respondents said that only $3,000 per month would actually save them from going bankrupt or cover their most pressing needs. So not very huge funding is really essential to help this local media to stay afloat. Another most pressing need was additional equipment. 64% of organizations said they needed more laptops, photo, video, and sound equipment. 43% said they needed more protective gear, medical kits, and insurance. More than 1/3 of local media organizations report that they would appreciate more psychological support to their employees. And 72% said that they also needed more employees and support with human resources, because in 1/3 of cases, the number of staff declined because many employees joined the armed forces, fled, or are forced to live under occupation. So after talking at length about challenges, I also want to address some opportunities that emerged quite surprisingly and paradoxically for Ukrainian media since the full-scale invasion by Russia. And the first thing that comes to my mind, that is shared by many of my colleagues with whom I spoke for this presentation, is that journalists are feeling more sense of purpose and importance of their work. And they see their work as essential in keeping the public informed of what is really happening, especially as Russian disinformation machine is still working very hard to, present alternative truths, alternative facts, which are obviously lies, and to distort the narrative of what is actually happening, to blame Ukraine for whatever possible. So the work of journalists in this situation is more important than ever, to be there, to talk to people, and to tell Ukrainian and foreign audience what is really happening. And of course, the voices and work of Ukrainian journalists are finally heard and appreciated abroad. This is also very important. And of course, I'm also very grateful, for this personally. And I think that's also the reason why I'm speaking to you today, because you are interested to hear what Ukrainian journalists have to say. Another important development, which in fact, I'm not sure if it's, so good for Ukrainian media or Ukrainian journalists, is that big international media, such as, for example, Washington Post, FT, or NPR, they started opening their bureaus in Kyiv rather than Moscow. Well, this is, of course, a very welcome development. In some cases, the staff in these bureaus are also Ukrainian journalists, but it's not always the case. So of course, it's good news for Ukrainian journalists if they are hired by this big international media to report on Ukraine. But unfortunately, it's not like always the case. So in some cases, it's still foreigners who are now based in Kyiv, which is anyway better than Moscow, who report on Ukraine. But it's a welcoming trend. And the last point that I would like to mention is that journalists are also involved in documentation of Russian war crimes and human rights abuses. And the evidence collected by them might potentially be used in the future in trials if it's collected according to legal criteria. And here I just mentioned several projects that are working on that, several media organizations. So the first one is the Reckoning Project. It's a cooperation of the Ukrainian Public Interest Journalism Lab, led by Natalia Gumanyuk, my colleague, and world-renowned reporter Janine Di Giovanni, to collect evidence of Russian war crimes and human rights abuses according to legal criteria that is needed for its future use in courts. I want to mention also the work of my colleague, another person I know personally, Yevhen Spirin, who is the editor-in-chief of an online media, Babel.ua. Yevhen has an experience of work as a forensic expert in his previous career. And after the deoccupation of Bucha, he started volunteering in Bucha morgue to help local authorities to identify the victims of Russian attacks on civilian population. And another project that I would like to mention is the Media Initiative for Human Rights, with which we also had the joint project, and we had several broadcasts on Twitter Spaces, talking about Russian war crimes, speaking with the survivors or witnesses of these crimes. It's a project that combines journalism and human rights activism to expose potential Russian war crimes, but also to advocate justice for the victims and survivors. So in this sense, the role of journalists is also crucial. So I think that's all for me at this moment, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olga. I'm sure there are lots of questions after such an informative talk. So now I'd like to open the floor for discussion. Feel free to submit your questions into the Q&A chat box if you're joining us online, or if you're here in the auditorium, just feel free to let us know if you have a question and we'll call on you. Does anyone have any questions, or do we have a question from?
We have a first question online. It was asked a little early in the presentation from Dr. Shana Plout from the University of Manitoba, and Shana had to leave a little bit early. That's why she posted her question a little bit early, but it's a good one. So if I may, I'll read it to you, Olga. Sure. Your question is, recognizing that objectivity is not the same as neutrality, how does one continue to engage in critical journalism, digging up hard truths, when one is living in fear, literally under siege? How does one balance nationalism, fear, with the professional responsibilities and norms of being a journalist? So I guess there's two questions there. The first one, how does one continue to engage in critical journalism, digging up hard truths, living in fear?
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question and not a very easy one to answer. I think when it comes to staying objective and continuing to report critically, that's what Ukrainian journalists have been continuing to do despite the war and the atrocities that were happening around them that personally affected them in some cases, or their families. For example, after some initial, I think, in the first weeks and months of war, focus only on war-related news, there were also, after some time passed, the work of investigative journalists exposing corruption resumed. So several investigations on Ukrainian oligarchs who were hiding in Monaco or in Paris or in Vienna were published, for example, by Ukrainska Pravda, which is the leading Ukrainian online medium. And I think it is remarkable, that Ukrainian journalists, even in wartime, continue to focus on exposing corruption, because it also is something that what Ukrainians are fighting for, what Ukrainian armed forces are fighting for, not only to defeat Russia, but also to transform Ukraine, to build a new country that would be free of corruption, that would be, democratic and prosperous. And I think the fact that Ukrainian journalists are able to continue covering these issues even during wartime and in very hard conditions is really remarkable and worth praise. And the second part of the question, how does one balance a nationalism fear with the professional responsibilities and norms of being a journalist? Well, I think of course Ukrainian journalists, especially if they work for foreign media outlets, they are aware that there might be some prejudice towards them, as that they might not be objective, or maybe they could be too emotional. They cannot remain neutral because it is about their country. I think everyone is aware of that, like Ukrainian journalists who work for foreign outlets, and that's why they try to do their work even more diligently in order to maintain the credibility and to show that they are professionals first of all. So I do not think that being a national of a country that is under attack somehow deprives you of professionalism or lowers the level of authority or credibility that you have. I think it's actually the opposite, because as a Ukrainian, you would try even harder to be neutral and impartial and to do a job well in order to remain credible.
Thank you, Olga. Was there a question in the room?
I have a question. You gave us some stats regarding the cooperation of the various journalist organizations. You said, if I remember right, 94% of Ukrainians are aware of that, 84% trust it. What are the statistics based on? Is it media themselves, or is it government staff? How are those numbers derived?
Yeah, I think you are referring to the statistics on the United TV marathon. These are results of a poll that was quoted by Detector Media, a website that writes on all media-related issues. So I found it there, but I'm not sure, who commissioned the poll. But there was no mention of any government connection.
Right. So a follow-up thought to that is that I believe the comment you made also that foreign journalists coming in, whether it's Washington Post or British, whatever the case, that they would often be given priority. And in a simple sense, you can understand why that would be, because of the trust of the local journalists, whether they're authentic or pro-Russian. But aside from that, is there a way for the local media to prove in a bona fide fashion that they are not pro-Russian in any way? Is there any credibility or sort of validation in that regard, so they don't need to face that discrimination in a way?
Well, I do not think, that if we are talking about the fact that sometimes foreign crews or foreign journalists are prioritized in terms of access to speakers or ability to make interviews with Ukrainian officials, I don't think this has to do with Ukrainian journalists being perceived as pro-Russian or biased. I think first of all, it has to do with the fact that Ukraine really relies on support of other countries of the West, in terms, of course, of the support to its military. And that's why I think the officials, they really want to get the message out of Ukraine. And also, I think the officials, they are somehow aware that Ukrainian journalists will find a way to report on the story anyway, because, well, Ukrainian journalists were there, are there, and will be there. So somehow I think kind of the fact that maybe they are not often prioritized is also due to this understanding among the officials that, Ukrainian journalists will anyway report. But if we say no, or if we ignore a request from the foreign media, then the story on Ukraine might not run, and it will be a missed opportunity. I do not think that there is any discrimination or, non-prioritization of Ukrainian journalists because they might be perceived as pro-Russian. I think, especially after the full-scale Russian invasion, there are no pro-Russian journalists in Ukraine, or it's really, they are not explicitly pro-Russian. It's impossible to be pro-Russian or somehow continue to do some advocating for Russia when there is literally genocide in your country. So I really don't think that's an issue.
Thank you for your presentation. What would you like journalists here who don't have the opportunity to travel to Ukraine to report on the war firsthand, like so many of our colleagues are from international media organizations, what would you like us to do to let the public know about what is happening in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you, Martin, for your question. Well, obviously, there needs to be reporting from the ground. It is essential. But if journalists cannot travel in Ukraine, still they would like to report on Ukraine, I think what they could do is connect to the Ukrainian community in their respective countries, to tell the stories of Ukrainian refugees, to tell the stories also of maybe, not necessarily Ukrainians, but those citizens in your countries who are engaged in support effort to Ukraine, because so many people around the world, in Canada, in the UK, in Germany, everywhere, help Ukraine, although they are not Ukrainians. So I think that would be very important. And, in terms of telling the stories of Ukrainian refugees, some of these refugees have also been witnesses, or sometimes maybe even victims or survivors of Russian war crimes and human rights abuses. I think it's very important to keep the focus on this issue. And they might share in due time, because some of them could be traumatized, some of them could be, not ready to talk about it just yet. However, I think it's their testimonies are very important and need to be documented. So I would encourage journalists to reach out to these people and try to, persuade them to share their stories.
So another question from an online participant. I'll just read the question because it's a good question, but it's very specific. PBS Frontline just featured how the software tracking program, Pegasus, has targeted journalists. Do Ukrainian journalists take special measures to protect identity and sources?
Thank you for this question. Well, obviously, Ukrainian journalists, when they report from the frontline positions, if we are talking about the coverage of war, they obviously try not to reveal the positions of Ukrainian military, because otherwise this, especially if it's a TV report, if there is video involved, these positions could be then geolocated and targeted by the Russian military. And actually there were some controversial episodes when Ukrainian positions or some Ukrainian military facilities were hit by Russian missiles or other Russian weapons after being featured on TV reports. And there was a debate in the media community also to whether how journalists should approach this, and even if sometimes the permit is given to film there, but how to show the video, how to film it in order to not to reveal, not to allow to geolocate this position. There was actually a case when there was a report on French TV on Ukrainian armed forces when the military positions were revealed, were easy to geolocate, and that position was hit several days later. And I think somehow Ukrainian journalists are more aware probably than their foreign colleagues of the importance of not revealing the positions, because they could endanger the soldiers and their lives, if they do. In terms of protecting the identities, I think this is mostly related to the identities of sources on the occupied territories, because there are a lot of pro-Ukrainian people who are located in the occupied parts of Kherson, Zaporizhia region, or Donetsk or Luhansk region, and sometimes they do speak to journalists. And from my personal experience and the experience, that what I see also on Ukrainian TV, well, obviously these people ask not to be identified by their real name. And if it's a video report, if it's a TV report, sometimes their faces are blurred, and the voices are changed.
A question in the room?
I have one question. How can journalists help in recording crimes of sexual violence in Ukraine during the war? Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Sexual violence is one of those war crimes that are frequently named hidden crimes, because this is something that its survivors are very often reluctant to talk about because of the feeling of guilt or shame, or the fear that the society would not, or their families would not accept them or turn away from them. So the most difficult task for journalists, I think, is to actually persuade the survivors to share their stories, to document these stories. Then the practice of persecution of war crimes in previous armed conflicts shows that very often sexual violence is that type of crime that goes unpunished, because it's very difficult to prove who the perpetrator was and to bring them to account. However, despite of this, I think it is essential that journalists continue covering this type of war crimes as well as other war crimes, and to talk about, how sexual violence is used as a weapon of war. And of course, it involves a lot of ethical issues, and there should be, every journalist who works with this topic needs to undergo a training on how to talk to survivors without re-traumatizing them. And of course, what I mentioned in my presentation, when we speak about the documentation of evidence of potential war crimes, it needs to be done according to specific legal criteria. So not every journalistic interview, not every journalistic, if we speak about like other war crimes when photos and videos are made, so not every documentation can be used in legal proceedings. There is very specific, there are very specific requirements for the documentation, so that they match legal criteria and can be used as evidence in court. And it's a very encouraging. The journalists are increasingly aware of that, and of course, not all of them, but at least some of them, they use this criteria as a guidance in their work, and that they cooperate also with international journalists, with international experts, with legal officers who have the experience in this field.
Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. We have another journalist who's online with us. This journalist happens to also be a master's student in our Peace and Conflict Studies program, and I'm going to invite her to turn on her microphone, introduce herself, and ask her a question.
Hi, Olga. Thank you so much for your time. I wanted to ask you something. Well, I am a journalist. I'm from Colombia, and I have been working with the government since I graduated from my bachelor's, and I was covering rural areas that had been impacted by the war, right? So I wanted to ask you if you guys have any strategy, or you are planning on creating one, to treat the journalists that have been that has been covering the war. I mean, in the mental health topic.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria, for your question. It's a very important issue that sometimes journalists tend to overlook because, you know, very often they see their work as a mission and themselves as just the mediums who deliver the message and who tell the stories of other people, and, you know, try to also tend to forget to take care about themselves and about their own mental health, because obviously when you listen and you witness so many horror stories and, you know, stories of extreme violence, sexual violence, bombardments, kidnappings, forced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, torture, rape. Well, obviously it has a huge toll on journalists' psychological well-being and emotional stability. Well, as far as I'm aware, there have been several initiatives launched since Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine that help journalists in various aspects. So they help to, for example, provide protective equipment and, you know, gear and medical kits to work on the front line, but they also offer psychological support, and they also offer to put journalists in touch with psychologists and therapists who would be able and willing to provide help for them. Of those initiatives that I personally heard of and that my colleagues participated in, I remember, for example, a retreat program in the Carpathian Mountains in the west of Ukraine. It was offered to female journalists who cover war, and several of my colleagues participated. Actually, they had a choice, so they were offered either to go for 3 days, for a weekend in the mountains, in a hotel, to just relax and talk to a psychologist and, you know, just do some self-care, spa procedures. Or they were offered also as an alternative, like a complete medical checkup, so like the health checkup, so they could just for free go and check their health in a private clinic in like 3 days. So they had an option, like which one to choose. However, I think that because the war is still going on, and you know, it's a marathon. Yes, it's a long run. I think like now majority of Ukrainians and Ukrainian journalists realize that, unlike in the first weeks and months when many people thought that, well, it will end soon. I think now the reality sank in that it's going to last for a longer period. However, I see that very often journalists, you know, are because it's going on and because it's still important to, you know, cover it and like nonstop, talk about it, travel, speak to people, so that journalists themselves, they do not allow to take breaks or to, you know, just stop and breathe or take care of themselves or talk to a therapist or a psychologist. There is still this kind of attitude that, well, we are not those who are suffering the most, so, you know, we shouldn't like stop working or focus on ourselves because there are more important things to do. So yes, while there are some initiatives, I think they are not enough, and most importantly, journalists, or many of them, do not perceive psychological help or the need to, you know, take a break and take care of themselves as something really essential and the priority at the moment.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much.
In the room, Clement?
Hi. So my question is, so earlier you said we all became, like, I think you were just using that quote, we all became war reporters. And, you know, Ilga stressed that existing discrimination and violence against LGBT people is aggravated during the war. I wonder, how do journalists cover marginalized communities' issues within the lens of peace journalism? And I'm also curious, what were some of the efforts for peace journalism before the war and now? How would you compare it?
Sorry, can you repeat the second part of your question?
Sure. What were some of the efforts for peace journalism before the war and now?
And can you explain what do you mean by peace journalism?
In terms of reporting, you know, issues within the lens of peace journalism.
could define peace journalism.
Well, I guess instead of aggravating some of the issues in an exaggerated way or misrepresentations, you would simply use, journalistics, tools or ways of explaining issues. For example, trans individuals are having issues in terms of accessing to their, hormones therapies or, medications and stuff like that. How do you see journalists, whether they are able to report these issues during the war or not, and you could certainly include other marginalized communities as struggles or issues as well?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think, I hope I understood it. So whether basically you're asking whether journalists have the ability and whether they are reporting on issues related to marginalized communities in the situation of war, whether they are just like consumed by all the reporting on war. So the answer is that, well, while obviously the main focus is on all war related news, also the scope of reporting, I think, has been widening as the war has been going on. So as I said, while initially in the first weeks and months of war, all the reporting was focused mainly, on the battlefield, what is going on the battlefield and what is happening in the cities under bombardment. So all the military, combat related reporting. So gradually the focus also widened to include other issues. One of them I mentioned, it's corruption, fight against corruption. And now I can say that reporting and the work of journalists in Ukraine is mostly, back, and if we talk about the variety of topics that they cover, is mostly back to pre-war levels. So all fields of life are being reported on. So regardless, despite the fact that the war is going on, that it's almost a year of war, there are still cultural events being held. Journalists still report on, the education reform or all the debates around the education of Ukrainian children who are studying online very often in Ukrainian schools, and then also if they are refugees in foreign schools. And this also applies to the reporting on various marginalized communities. One example that comes to my mind is, but of course it is still through the war lens, so there is reporting, but it's mostly on how these communities have been affected by the war, whether everything is okay, what can we do? So one example that comes to my mind is the reporting on people with disabilities and how they were able to or not able to be evacuated from the areas where the active fighting was going on or where active bombardments was going on. So I remember a series of reports in Ukrainian media focusing on that issue of, whether there is enough help for people with disabilities to leave these areas affected, and what happens after they do it. Well, obviously, we cannot say that it's 100% as it was before the war, because anyway, it's still the reporting on other issues is still interconnected with the topic of war. But from what I observe, there is still the attention to other issues. So it's not only news from the battlefield or military related news.
There's just a little bit of time left, Olga, and there's one more question online that was patiently put there a little while ago, and I'm just going to paraphrase it to use the little bit of time we have left. In your presentation, you referred to the new legislation and sort of government making some effort to control things. And so the question is if you notice this happening, do you think there's a way for them to do it without infringing the freedom of press? I mean, is it an inevitable tension? And it's just something you have to live with? To what extent are journalists feeling maybe a little bit of pressure from the new legislation or from the way the government is behaving?
Well, Ukraine used to have a very diverse and varied media landscape, of course, with its own issues, but one can argue quite confidently that there was freedom of speech in Ukraine before the Russian full-scale invasion. Well, obviously, after the introduction of the martial law, there were some restrictions imposed on on the freedom of speech. And for example, this is also this United TV marathon, when all the biggest TV stations are broadcasting the same news and analysis 24/7. So there is less variety between the reporting. So the viewer and the public maybe has less access to different points of view. However, it still has access to different points of view, because even though opposition TV channels do not participate in this United TV marathon and they were disconnected from digital networks, they are still available on satellite, they are available online. So if one wants to hear different opinions, there is a way to do it. But of course, while journalists, they, especially like in the initial period of war, they accepted this restrictions because of the martial law, because of the threat to the existence of Ukraine as an independent state. They are eager to express their concerns and discontent if if the government is doing something that, in the view of the Ukrainian media communities, and looks like an infringement of press freedom. And the debate, for example, on accreditations to journalists in Kherson was one example of that. With the media law, well, it's still too early to say. I mentioned, the criticism, the potential loopholes in this law that may emerge in the future. But so far, we do not have the evidence to say that actually, there are issues, there are problems with this law, because it is being implemented and it causes danger to freedom of speech. But it's good, I think, that there is still this debate that potential loopholes and potential threat of the abuse of its powers by this National Council on TV and Radio is discussed, because it means that there is still room for debate in the Ukrainian media community and in Ukrainian civil society in general.
Thank you so much, Olga. And now it's time to wrap up our session. So thank you once again, Olga, for joining us here today and for this rich discussion. Thank you to all of you for asking your questions and for your interest in Ukraine. Stay tuned for more events from the Monocle Institute and from the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies. And Slava Ukraini!
Heroям слава, and thank you very much.